Imagine standing on a beach in southern Spain. The year is 1468. You are a fisherman, mending your nets in the morning sun, when you see them on the horizon. Ships, but not like any ships you have ever seen. No square sails of Genoa. No crescent flags of the Moors. These vessels are strange, low to the water, painted in colours that seem to drink the light. And as they draw closer, you see the men aboard them. Copper-skinned warriors, wearing cloaks of brilliant feathers, carrying weapons of black volcanic glass that catch the sun like frozen night. They have crossed an ocean you believed was endless. They have come from a world you did not know existed. And in their wake, they carry something that will change everything. Not gunpowder, not steel, but an idea. The idea that history could have flowed in the opposite direction. Welcome, friends. This is a journey into the world that never was. Tonight, we explore one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca had reached Europe first? What if, instead of Columbus sailing west, it was the peoples of the Americas who sailed east? What if the conquerors and the conquered had traded places? Before we begin this voyage, across an ocean of time and possibility, I want to invite you to join us. If you enjoy explorations like this, where history meets imagination, hit that subscribe button. And leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that somewhere right now, and we are all sharing this same moment, this same story. Now, close your eyes if you wish. Let the world you know fade for a while. We are going back 6 centuries, to a time before the world became the world you recognize, to a time when 2 halves of humanity still lived in separate dreams. And we are going to ask a simple question. What if they had met differently? Let's begin. Chapter 1. The World Before. The year is 1443, and in the Valley of Mexico, something impossible is about to happen. The city rises from the lake at dawn like a dream half-remembered. Tenochtitlan, the place where the cactus grows from stone, the heart of the Mexica world. If you could stand on the southern causeway in this moment, in this year before everything changes, you would see something that exists nowhere else on earth. A city built on water. Not beside water, like Venice or Constantinople, but truly on it. Floating gardens stretch in perfect geometric grids toward the island center. Chinampas. They are called rectangles of earth and reeds where corn and beans and flowers for the temples grow in soil, more fertile than any farmer in Europe has ever touched. 200,000 people live here. More than Paris. More than London. More than any city north of the Alps. They do not know this, of course. They have never heard of Paris or London, but they know their city is the center of the world, the place where earth meets sky, where the gods descended and men ascended, where the 5th sun burns in the heavens and the calendar turns with the precision of the stars themselves. 3 causeways connect the island to the shores of Lake Texcoco, broad roads of packed earth and stone, wide enough for 8 men to walk abreast. Along these causeways, every morning before the sun clears the mountains, come the tribute bearers. Men carrying bundles of cacao from the hot lands, women with baskets of cotton and vanilla and brilliant quetzal feathers, porters bent beneath the weight of jade and obsidian, and gold worked into shapes that catch the light. This is the economy of empire. The triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. 50 cities pay tribute to the Mexica. Hundreds of thousands of people labor in fields and workshops to feed this appetite for beauty and power and the favor of gods who hunger for both. Behind the city, 2 mountains rise into the sky. Popocatépetl, and Iztaccíhuatl, the smoking mountain and the sleeping woman. Even in summer, their peaks wear crowns of snow. The Mexica believe these mountains are gods who loved each other in human form and were transformed by grief into eternal stone. On clear mornings, you can see thin ribbons of smoke rising from Popocatépetl crater, a reminder that the earth beneath this valley is alive. That creation and destruction sleep in the same bed. The temples dominate the skyline, not tall and thin like the spires of Gothic cathedrals reaching toward a single heaven, but broad and stepped like mountains themselves. The Templo Mayor, the great double pyramid at the city's heart, rises in tiers of stone painted white and red and blue. At its summit, 2 shrines, one for Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war and sun, one for Tlaloc, the ancient rain god whose tears bring life to the corn. Every day, priests in black robes stained with holy blood climb those 114 steps. Every day, offerings are made. Flowers, incense, quail. And yes, sometimes, human hearts still beating as they are lifted toward the sky. This is not cruelty, as the Mexica understand it. This is reciprocity. The gods gave their blood to create the world. The fifth sun, the current age of creation, was born when the gods threw themselves into fire at Teotihuacan and became the sun and moon. To keep that sun moving across the sky, to prevent the universe from sliding back into chaos and darkness, humanity must give blood in return. Life for life. Heart for heart. It is not murder. It is maintenance. The cosmos runs on sacrifice, and the Mexica are merely keeping their side of the bargain. But there is more to this city than blood and stone. In the marketplaces, 40,000 people gather each day to trade. Cacao beans serve as currency. A rabbit costs 10 beans. A slave, a strong one, might cost 100. You can buy medicines made from herbs gathered in forests the Mexica have catalogued with the precision of scientists. You can buy textiles woven in patterns so complex they seem to move in the light. You can buy obsidian blades sharper than any steel Europe has yet forged. Volcanic glass napped to an edge, only a few molecules thick. The Mexica have no iron, no bronze, no wheels for carts, no horses or cattle or sheep, but they have maize, which feeds more people per acre than wheat ever could. They have the chinampas, which produce harvests year-round. They have a calendar more accurate than the Julian calendar Europe still uses. They have astronomers who can predict eclipses, the movements of Venus, the return of comets. They have a system of schools where every child, noble and commoner alike, learns history and song and the duties owed to family and empire and gods. They believe they live at the center of the world. And in a way, they do. Everything they know revolves around this valley, this lake, this city. Beyond the mountains lie other peoples. Some allied, some conquered, some still free and dangerous. But beyond that, the ocean to the east is a mystery, a vast emptiness. The edge of the world, perhaps, or the realm of gods and monsters. No one crosses it. No one thinks to try. Until one morning, when 12 men who were never supposed to return come home with stories that will break the world open. The merchant canoe left the coast of Yucatan on a morning like any other morning. 40 feet of ceiba wood, carved from a single tree, loaded with trade goods for the coastal settlements to the north. Cacao, jade, feathers, obsidian blades wrapped in cotton to protect the edges. 12 men crewed her. Traders, mostly. A few younger sons of noble families looking to make their fortune in the coastal trade. One priest, elderly, going to consult with the wise men of a distant city about a question of calendar interpretation. They had seen storms before. Every man who works the Caribbean knows the sky can turn violent without warning. But this was different. It came from the east, out of the open ocean, where no storms should originate. The sky turned the color of old bruises. The wind began to scream. Not howl. Scream. Like a jaguar denied its kill. Like a god in pain. The waves grew tall enough to hide the sun. The canoe, which had seemed so sturdy in harbour, became a splinter of wood tossed on the back of something vast and uncaring. They tried to turn back. The paddlers strained until their muscles tore and their hands bled. But the wind and current were stronger. They were being pushed east. Away from land. Away from everything they knew. Into the emptiness. The storm lasted 3 days. Maybe 4. Time became meaningless. There was only the work of staying alive, bailing water, lashing themselves to the hull, praying to Chak, the Maya rain god, to Tlaloc, to any deity who might hear and care. The elderly priest led chants when his voice could be heard above the wind, songs of supplication, promises of tribute if only they might be delivered. On the second day, a wave took 2 men, just swept them over the side like dust brushed from a table. They screamed once and were gone. On the 3rd day, the mast broke. On the 4th day, or perhaps it was the 5th, the storm finally died. But by then, they were lost. The sun rose in the east, as it always had. But the stars at night were wrong. Subtly wrong. The familiar constellations had shifted. New stars appeared that no Maya astronomer had ever charted. The ocean around them was a different color. Darker. Colder. They were in a current, a river in the sea, moving north and east at a speed that made paddling pointless. They rationed what was left. Rainwater caught in the storm. Some dried fish that had survived in a sealed container. Cacao beans, which could be chewed for their bitter strength. But it was not enough. Men began to die. First from injuries sustained in the storm. Then from thirst. Then from hunger. Then from despair. By the time land appeared on the horizon, only 3 men remained alive. The priest was not among them. He had given his water ration to a younger man and laid down one night and simply not awakened. They had no strength left to give him a proper burial. They let the ocean take him, singing what prayers they could remember through cracked lips and swollen tongues. The land, when they reached it, was not the Yucatan. The beach was wrong. The sand too pale. The vegetation too sparse. And the people who found them dragged their canoe onto the shore, gave them water and strange flat bread, and stared at them with expressions mixing fear and wonder. These people had skin the color of deep mahogany and spoke a language that sounded like drums and flowing water. One of the survivors, a trader named Ixquat, would later say that he thought they had died in the storm, and this was the underworld. Xibalba, the place of fright where the soul must pass through trials before it can reach peace. Because surely this could not be the same earth. Surely the gods would not have created 2 such different worlds and placed them so far apart and kept them secret from each other for so long. But it was Earth, just a different part of it. The coast of West Africa. The shores of what would one day be called Senegal or Gambia. A place where kingdoms rose and fell, where trade routes connected forest to desert, to distant Mediterranean, where Arabic and local tongues mixed in marketplaces as cosmopolitan as any in the world. The Maya traders spent 3 months in that village, learning, healing, trying to understand. An Arab merchant, a man who had travelled from Morocco down the coast buying gold and selling salt and cloth, became their bridge to communication. Through him, through gestures and drawings in sand, through the slow, painful construction of shared vocabulary, they learned that this land had a name, that it was part of a wider world, that to the north lay other lands, other peoples, kingdoms of pale-skinned strangers who worshipped a god nailed to crossed wood. And the strangers, in turn, learned of the Maya, of cities in jungles, of pyramids and calendars and oceans crossed by accident. The Arab merchant examined the few trade goods that had survived. He held an obsidian blade up to the light and tested its edge against his thumbnail and said something in Arabic that the Maya did not understand, but that translated roughly as, "These people are not savages." When a trading dhow finally agreed to take them south and then west, following the currents and winds back toward the Caribbean, the 3 survivors carried with them a piece of iron, just a small blade, crude and rough, but harder than anything they had ever seen. They carried cloth woven in patterns their wives would not believe. They carried memories of a world that was not supposed to exist. The journey home took longer than the journey out. They had to work their passage. They had to wait for favorable winds. But eventually, impossibly, they saw the coast of Yucatan again. They made landfall near a fishing village whose people fled at the sight of them, thinking them ghosts. It took 3 days to convince anyone they were real, that they had been gone for over a year, that they had crossed the ocean and returned. When they finally reached the nearest Maya city and told their story to the council of elders, they were not believed. "Madmen," the elders said, touched by gods or demons, their minds broken by the trauma of the storm. The iron blade was examined and dismissed as a curiosity, probably looted from a shipwreck. The cloth was beautiful, but proved nothing. And the stories of dark-skinned people and pale-skinned people and lands across the Eastern Ocean, these were clearly fever dreams. Only one man believed them. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, only one man wanted to believe them badly enough to act on that belief. His name, in the Nahuatl tongue, spoken in Tenochtitlan, was Tlacaelel the Younger, and he was about to change the world. Tlacaelel the Younger was not the emperor. He was not a general or a high priest or a wealthy merchant prince. He was something more subtle and perhaps more dangerous. He was a senior astronomer priest, a keeper of the calendar, a man who spent his nights on the high platforms watching the stars and his days advising the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, the emperor, on matters of cosmic timing and religious duty. He heard the story of the survivors 3 years after their return. By then, it had already become legend, distorted and dismissed. But Tlacaelel sought them out. He travelled to the coast. He interviewed each man separately, comparing their accounts, noting where they agreed and where memory had warped. He examined the iron blade with the careful attention of a man trained to read meaning in the movement of celestial bodies. He performed calculations. If a canoe could drift east in a storm and find land, he reasoned, then land must exist to the east. If the current had carried them there, then the current could be mapped and followed deliberately. If there were people there, then there could be trade. Knowledge. Power. His colleagues thought him mad. The ocean to the east was infinite, they said. Or worse, it was the domain of the gods and should not be trespassed upon. The survivors had been fortunate to return alive. To deliberately seek that place would be hubris. It would anger the gods. It would end in disaster. But Tlacaelel had an advantage. He believed in the stars more than he believed in luck. He had spent decades studying the movements of Venus, predicting its heliacal rising with accuracy that let the Mexica time their wars and festivals and planting seasons. He knew that the universe operated on principles, patterns, mathematics. If the ocean had currents, those currents followed rules. If the stars shifted position with latitude, then position could be calculated. Navigation was not magic. It was astronomy applied to water instead of sky. For 5 years, he experimented. He built model boats and tested them in Lake Texcoco. He interviewed every coastal fisherman he could find, learning about winds and tides and the behavior of water. He studied the few surviving Maya codices that dealt with maritime trade. He became obsessed. The mockery from court was constant. Tlacaelel the dreamer, they called him. Tlacaelel the fool. Even the emperor, Moctezuma I, regarded him with the sort of patient amusement one reserves for a brilliant man pursuing an impossible goal. The empire had real problems. Rebellious tribute cities. Drought in the southern provinces. Tensions with the Tarascans to the west, who had somehow learned to work metal and whose weapons were more durable than obsidian. An expedition into the Eastern Ocean seemed like a waste of resources. But then the drought worsened. 3 years of insufficient rain. The Chinampa still produced, but the outlying farms suffered. Food prices in the markets climbed. People began to whisper that the gods were displeased, that the sacrifices were not enough, that the current emperor lacked the favor of Huitzilopochtli. And Tlacaelel saw his opening. He requested an audience with Moctezuma, not in the public throne room, but in the private chambers where the emperor consulted his closest advisors. There, he made his case. Not as a dreamer, but as a priest offering a solution to a crisis of divine favor. The gods have sent us a message, Tlacaelel said. They sent the storm. They sent the survivors. They showed us that the world is larger than we knew. And now they send drought to tell us that staying in this valley is not enough. We must grow. We must explore. We must prove ourselves worthy of the fifth sun by expanding the light of Tenochtitlan beyond any boundary our ancestors imagined. It was a calculated speech. Tlacaelel knew Moctezuma's weaknesses. The emperor was pious but also ambitious. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest of the Mexica rulers. He wanted monuments and conquests and achievements that would dwarf his predecessors. And if you are wrong? Moctezuma asked. If you sail into the Eastern Ocean and are swallowed by it, if the ships never return and we have wasted resources and men on your obsession, Tlacaelel met his emperor's eyes. Then my family pays the price. Strip them of rank and property. But if I am right, if we reach the lands the survivors spoke of and return with knowledge and trade and proof that the Mexica can go anywhere, then you will be the emperor who opened the world. Moctezuma considered this. Political calculation moved behind his eyes. If the expedition failed, he could blame Tlacaelel and use the failure to consolidate power by stripping a rival family. If it succeeded, he would gain enormous prestige. It was a wager with acceptable risks. Build your fleet, Moctezuma said. You have 2 years. Chapter 2. The Crossing. The construction began on the shores of Lake Texcoco in the dry season of 1457. Tlacaelel commissioned the finest boat builders from the coastal cities. Maya, craftsmen who understood ceiba wood and how to carve it. Totonac engineers who knew the behavior of waves and wind. He brought them to the lake and told them to build something that had never existed before. Not trading canoes for hugging coastlines. Not fishing boats for calm waters. But ocean vessels. Ships that could survive storms and carry provisions for months and hold 50 men each. The design they settled on was a hybrid. The base was Maya, a large dugout canoe, but expanded. 60 feet long, 8 feet at the beam, with outriggers for stability and a single mast for a square sail woven from maguey fiber. The wood was treated with pine resin to seal it against water. The hull was reinforced with internal ribs. Storage compartments were built into the floor for fresh water, dried corn, beans, fish, and cacao. 6 ships. That was the final count. It took every favor Tlacaelel had accumulated in 3 decades of court service. It took the emperor's direct order compelling tribute cities to supply wood and labor. It took silver and jade and promises of glory. But by the spring of 1459, 6 ships sat in the waters of Lake Texcoco, and 300 men had volunteered to crew them. Not all volunteers were accepted. Tlacaelel selected carefully. Warriors, yes, but not the youngest, or most aggressive. He wanted men with discipline, men who could follow orders during months of monotony. He chose scribes to record the journey, astronomers to help navigate, priests to maintain morale and perform the necessary rituals, physicians who knew herbs and healing, and he chose some of the coastal survivors who had made the accidental crossing years before, men who had seen the other side and lived. The training took months. The crews practiced on the lake until they could coordinate paddle strokes without thinking. They learned to read the sky for weather. They learned to ration food and water. They learned to trust each other, because trust would be the only thing holding them together when land disappeared in all directions. The religious preparation was equally intense. 40 days of fasting for the senior crew members. Bloodletting rituals where they drew thorns through their tongues and earlobes, offering their blood to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who was also the god of wind. The priests consulted the sacred calendar to find an auspicious day. They read omens in the flight of birds and the behavior of animals and the patterns of clouds at sunrise. Not all the omens were favorable. 2 days before the planned departure, a jaguar was seen on the southern causeway. Jaguars did not live near Tenochtitlan. It should not have been there. Some priests argued this was a warning from the gods to stop, but others argued it was Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror god, testing their courage. Tlacaelel listened to both interpretations and made his decision. They would go. The night before departure, the families came. Wives and mothers and children walking through the camps where the crews had gathered. There was no certainty of return. Everyone understood this. The previous accidental voyage had killed 9 of 12 men. A deliberate voyage across unknown distances might kill everyone. The women brought food. The children brought flowers. The men accepted both and tried not to show their fear. Tlacaelel himself did not sleep that night. He stood on the bow of the lead ship, the one he would command, and looked east across the dark water of the lake toward the mountains. Beyond those mountains lay the coast. Beyond the coast lay the ocean. And beyond the ocean, if his calculations were right, if the survivors had not been mad or lying, lay another world. He thought about what he was doing, the arrogance of it, the presumption that a man could simply decide to sail off the edge of the known world and expect to return. But he also thought about the alternative, staying in the valley, watching the empire slowly consume itself, watching the 5th sun burn down to ash without having expanded the light beyond these mountains, this lake, this narrow slice of creation. No, better to risk everything than to risk nothing. Dawn came with clear skies and a wind from the west. The priests declared it favorable. The emperor himself came to the lake shore, dressed in his full regalia, the cloak of Quetzal feathers and the crown of jade and gold. He gave a speech about duty and glory and the favor of the gods. The crowd that had gathered, tens of thousands strong, cheered and threw flowers into the water. Tlacaelel boarded his ship. The crews took their positions. The sails were raised. And slowly, with the entire city watching, 6 ships moved across Lake Texcoco toward the eastern shore, toward the causeway that would take them to the coast, toward the ocean that would take them to the edge of everything. By noon, they had passed through the eastern gate of the city. By evening, they were beyond the lake, and by the time the sun set behind the mountains, turning the sky the color of fire and blood, Tenochtitlan had disappeared behind them. There was no turning back now. There was only forward, only east, only the unknown. The ocean revealed itself slowly, first as a thin line of blue beyond the coastal hills, then as a presence, vast and indifferent, stretching to a horizon that seemed to curve away from the world. The ships had been blessed at a small coastal temple. Local fishermen had given advice about currents and told stories about ancestors who had ventured far from shore and what they had seen. Dolphins, whales, flying fish that leaped from the water like silver birds, and storms. Always the warning about storms. The first week was almost pleasant. The weather held fair. The wind pushed them steadily east and north. The crews fell into routines. Every morning at dawn, the priests on each ship sang prayers to Tonatiuh, the sun, thanking him for rising once more and begging him to continue his journey across the sky. Every evening, they sang to the stars, asking for guidance. Between these rituals, there was work, paddling when the wind died, fishing when opportunity arose, maintaining the ships, bailing the small amounts of water that always found their way in, and watching, always watching the horizon for any sign of land or danger. Tlacaelel kept a codex, a bark paper book where he recorded each day. Wind direction, cloud patterns, the angle of the sun at noon, the position of stars at night. He was building a map, not of land, but of the ocean itself. The currents, the wind patterns, the color of the water which changed from green near shore to deep blue in the open sea. He believed that if they survived, this knowledge would be more valuable than any gold or jade they might bring back. The food was monotonous but sufficient. Dried fish that had been salted and smoked, corn cakes, wrapped in leaves, beans, cacao mixed with water for a bitter drink that gave strength. They caught fresh fish when they could. Once, a large turtle was spotted and hauled aboard. It fed all 6 ships, and its shell was kept as an offering for Tlaloc, the rain god, in hopes of favorable weather. But the ocean was not empty. On the 8th day, they saw their first whale. It surfaced beside the lead ship, massive beyond belief, a creature the size of a temple that breathed water into the air through a hole in its head. The crews were terrified. Some believed it was Sipactli, the great earth monster from the creation stories. But the whale only looked at them with an eye as large as a shield, and then dove beneath the waves and disappeared. The priests declared it an omen. The gods of the deep had seen them and judged them worthy to continue. By the 2nd week, the initial excitement had faded into routine. This was the dangerous time, when the novelty wore off, and there was only the endless rocking of the boats, the same food every day, the same faces, the same tasks. Men began to argue over small things. Who had taken more than their ration? Who was not pulling their weight on the paddles? Who snored too loudly in the cramped sleeping quarters? Tlacaelel watched for signs of serious trouble. He knew from the stories of the survivors that despair was as dangerous as any storm. He moved among the ships when they rafted together each evening, talking to the men, listening to complaints, settling disputes, reminding them of the purpose. They were not just sailing east. They were carrying the light of Tenochtitlan beyond any boundary their people had known. They were proving that the Mexica could master even the ocean. On the 15th day, the first man died, not from violence or accident, but from a sickness that came on suddenly. Fever, chills, vomiting that would not stop. The physicians tried their herbs and prayers, but nothing helped. By dawn, he was gone. His name was Chimali. He had been a warrior from a noble family. He had survived 3 campaigns against the Tarascans, and now he died on a boat in the middle of the ocean, far from his home, far from any temple where proper rites could be performed. They wrapped his body in cotton. They placed his most precious possessions with him, a jade bead, an obsidian knife, a small figure of Huitzilopochtli, carved from volcanic stone. The priest sang the songs meant for warriors who died in battle, because surely this journey was a kind of battle. And then they lowered him into the ocean and watched him sink into the blue depths and disappear. That night, the mood in the fleet was dark. Men whispered that this was the first of many deaths, that they would all end up in the belly of the ocean, food for fish, forgotten by the gods and by history. Tlacaelel let them whisper. Fear was natural. But the next morning, he gave an order. Every ship was to gather together. And when they had formed a tight circle, hulls almost touching, he stood on the bow of his vessel and spoke. Chimali is not lost, he said. He has gone ahead of us. He will tell the gods of the deep that we are coming. He will prepare the way. When we reach the other shore, when we find the lands the survivors spoke of, his spirit will be there waiting. He died as a warrior dies. In service. In sacrifice. With purpose. And we honor him not by turning back, but by continuing forward. It was theater. Performance. But it worked. The men needed to believe their deaths would have meaning, that this was not just madness but a sacred mission. They needed to believe that Tlacaelel knew where he was going and why. The truth was more complicated. Tlacaelel did not know if they would find land. He had calculations, yes. Observations, the stories of men who had drifted east and returned. But calculations could be wrong. Stories could be lies or dreams. Every day they sailed farther from certainty and deeper into faith. Faith that the ocean had a far shore. Faith that they could reach it before supplies ran out or storms destroyed them. Faith that the gods wanted them to succeed. By the third week, the stars had changed enough that even men without astronomical training could see it. Familiar constellations had shifted. New stars appeared on the northern horizon. They were farther from home than any Mexica had ever been. The ocean surrounded them completely now. No birds. No floating vegetation. Just water to every horizon and the sky above and the tiny wooden vessels that were the only solid things in the world. The men began to see things. Tricks of light and exhaustion. One claimed he saw a city floating in the clouds. Another swore he heard singing from beneath the waves. These were not madness exactly. Just the mind trying to fill an emptiness too vast to comprehend. Tlacaelel watched and noted who was struggling and made sure those men were given extra duties. Idle minds invited despair. Better to keep them busy. On the 24th day, the wind died completely. The ocean became glass. The ships sat motionless, sails hanging limp, and the sun beat down with a heat that seemed to press on the skull like a stone. This was almost worse than a storm. At least in a storm there was action, crisis, purpose. But in this dead calm there was only waiting, and the slow consumption of water and food and hope. They paddled, 50 men per ship, working in shifts, trying to maintain forward motion. But it was exhausting, and they were already tired, and the ocean was infinite. After 2 days of this, Tlacaelel was considering the unthinkable, rationing water more severely, perhaps turning back, perhaps admitting that the ocean had won. And then, on the morning of the 26th day, a wind came from the west. Just a breath at first, then stronger. The sails filled. The ships began to move. The men cheered. And Tlacaelel stood at the bow and thanked Quetzalcoatl, the god of wind, and promised greater sacrifices if only they were delivered to land. The wind held. For 5 days, they made better progress than they had since leaving the coast. The water changed color again, from deep blue to a strange greenish tint. And there were birds. Small at first, then larger. Seabirds that dove for fish. Birds that meant land was somewhere within their range of flight. On the 33rd day of the voyage, Tlacaelel allowed himself to believe, truly believe, that they might survive this. He was wrong about many things, but about that, he was right. It came without the courtesy of warning. The sky that had been clear at sunset was black by midnight. The stars disappeared behind clouds that seemed to hang just above the masts. The wind that had been pushing them steadily east began to veer and gust, and finally to scream. This was not like the storm that had scattered the original merchant canoe. This was worse. This was the ocean asserting itself, reminding these small wooden things, and the even smaller men aboard them, that they existed here only by permission, and that permission could be revoked at any moment. The ships tried to stay together. They had ropes connecting them during the calm, thick cables of woven Magui fiber. But as the waves grew, those ropes became deadly. When one ship crested a wave and another was in a trough, the tension could snap a rope hard enough to cut a man in half. Tlacaelel gave the order. Cut the lines. Each ship was on its own now. The next 3 days existed outside of time. There was no day or night, just varying shades of grey and black. There was no forward or backward, just up and down as waves tall as temple walls lifted the ships toward the sky and dropped them into valleys of water. The men stopped trying to paddle. All effort went to survival, bailing water, lashing themselves to anything solid, holding on. Men were swept overboard. Tlacaelel lost count of how many. 3 from his ship, maybe 4. He heard screams from nearby vessels, but could not see them through the sheets of rain and spray. The mast on one ship cracked and fell, crushing 2 men beneath it. Another ship's outrigger shattered, leaving the vessel unstable, rolling wildly. The priests tried to maintain rituals, singing prayers, making offerings by tossing precious jade into the ocean, calling on Tlaloc to have mercy. But their voices were lost in the wind, and after a while they simply held on like everyone else and waited to see if the gods wanted them to live or die. Tlacaelel lashed himself to the stern of his ship and tried to think through the chaos. If they survived this, they would be scattered. The fleet would be broken. Each ship would have to find its own way to land, or back home, or to whatever fate awaited. He thought about the men under his command, the wives and children waiting in Tenochtitlan, the emperor who had authorized this and who would need someone to blame if it failed. He thought about drowning, whether it would hurt, whether his soul would find its way to the afterlife, or whether dying this far from home meant some kind of spiritual exile. And then, because there was nothing else to do, and because he had promised himself at the beginning of this that he would document everything, he unwrapped his codex from its waterproof bundle and tried to write. His hands shook. The bark paper was damp despite the ceiling, but he recorded what he could. The date by the sacred calendar, the direction of the wind, the height of the waves, everything that might be useful if somehow, impossibly, anyone ever read this. On what he thought was the 3rd night of the storm, though it could have been the 4th, the sky began to clear. Not all at once, just gaps in the clouds where stars showed through. The wind was still strong but no longer trying to kill them. The waves were still tall but had lost their chaotic violence. The worst had passed. Dawn revealed the cost. Of the 6 ships that had left the coast, Tlacaelel could see only 4. His own vessel, 2 others nearby, damaged but afloat. And far to the south, barely visible on the horizon, a 4th, no sign of the other 2. Gone. Sunk or scattered beyond sight. 80 men lost. Maybe more. The survivors rafted together and took stock. One ship was taking on water faster than it could be bailed. The crew and what could be salvaged were distributed among the other 3 vessels. The damaged ship was set adrift with a prayer. It would serve as an offering to Tlaloc, a floating temple to the rain god who had tested them and found some worthy of survival. The mood was grim. More than a third of the expedition was dead or missing. Supplies had been lost in the storm. One of the water containers on Tlacaelel's ship had cracked, spilling precious fresh water into the bilge. They had food for perhaps 3 more weeks if they rationed carefully. Water for less. Some men argued they should turn back, try to retrace their path while they still had strength. But Tlacaelel stood before them and made his case one more time. "We are closer to the eastern shore than to the western one," he said. "The storm pushed us forward, not back. To turn around now would mean crossing the same distance we have already covered, with less food, less water, and broken ships. Our only choice is forward." It was not strictly true. He did not know how far they had come, or how far remained. But it sounded true. And truth, in that moment, was less important than conviction. The men needed to believe there was only one path, that the decision had already been made by the gods and by the ocean and by fate. They needed to believe in forward. So they sailed east. 3 ships where there had been 6. 170 men where there had been 300. Damaged and depleted and very far from home. But still moving. Still believing. Still carrying the light of Tenochtitlan toward a horizon that refused to reveal what lay beyond it. On the 41st day since leaving the coast, they saw the first bird. Not a seabird hunting fish far from shore, but a small brown thing that landed on the mast of Tlacaelel's ship and sat there for an hour, resting, before flying away to the east. Land birds could not survive indefinitely over open ocean. This one had come from somewhere, was going to somewhere, and that somewhere was east. The men's spirits lifted. They began to watch the sky constantly for more birds. They checked the watercolor every morning. They sniffed the air for any scent besides salt and fish. They were hunting for land the way a starving man hunts for food. On the 43rd day, they found floating vegetation. Not seaweed, which they had seen before, but pieces of plants that grew on land. Leaves, twigs, a small branch with moss still clinging to it. Something had washed into the ocean recently. A river, perhaps. Rivers meant land. The water itself began to change. The deep blue of the open ocean gave way to a lighter shade. Not green yet, but trending that direction. And the water was warmer. They were in a current, a river in the sea, moving northeast. Tlacaelel recognized it from the descriptions the original survivors had given. This was the same current that had carried them to the other side. The same path. They were following an invisible road. On the 45th day, they saw birds constantly. Dozens of species they had never encountered. Some diving for fish. Some flying in formation. Some following the ships as if curious about these strange floating things. And where there were birds in such numbers, there had to be land. Had to be. The tension became unbearable. Every man was on watch now. Sleep was impossible. They stared at the eastern horizon until their eyes burned, searching for any variation in the line where ocean met sky. Any shadow. Any hint. Anything that was not water. The food was nearly gone. They were eating the last of the dried fish, rationing it out in portions that could not sustain a man. The water was worse. Each person received a few swallows morning and evening. Throats were cracked and bleeding. Lips split. Some men tried drinking seawater despite being warned it would kill them faster than thirst. The physicians did what they could, but there were no herbs that could create fresh water from salt. On the morning of the 47th day, the lookout on the lead ship screamed, not called out, not shouted, screamed. Land. It was not a dream, not a mirage, not clouds sitting low on the horizon. It was earth. Solid. Real. A dark line to the east that grew clearer as the morning sun climbed higher. Trees. Hills. A coastline. The men wept. Some fell to their knees. The priests sang every prayer they knew to every god they could name. Tlacaelel stood at the bow and felt something break open in his chest. Relief. Vindication. Terror. They had done it. They had crossed the ocean. They had found the other side of the world. And now they had to survive whatever came next. The fishermen led them inland. Not far. Perhaps half a mile from the beach through a path that wound between palm trees and low scrub vegetation. The Mexica warriors kept hands near their obsidian blades, not from aggression, but from caution born of exhaustion and uncertainty. But the locals seemed more curious than hostile. Children followed at a distance, wide-eyed and whispering. Women peered from doorways of structures built from mud, brick and thatch, architecture utterly foreign to men who built with stone and knew cities that floated on lakes. The village was small, perhaps 200 people. The houses were arranged without the geometric precision the Mexica expected from settlements. There was a central area where fires burned, and large clay pots sat in the shade. Nets hung drying on wooden frames. Chickens scratched in the dirt. Dogs barked and were silenced by sharp words from their owners. It was a working village, a fishing village, poor by the standards of Tenochtitlan, but not desperate. The people were fed. The children were healthy. This was a place where life continued in patterns worn smooth by generations. The elder who had first approached them on the beach led them to the larger structure. Not a temple, not a palace, something closer to a meeting house. Inside, it was cool and dark. Mats were spread on the packed earth floor. The Mexica sat, grateful to be out of the sun. Water was brought again. More food. And then they waited while runners were sent to fetch someone important. Tlacaelel used the time to observe. The pottery was different from anything made in Mesoamerica. The weaving techniques visible in the cloth were unfamiliar. The tools he could see were iron, not obsidian, not copper. Iron, crude by what standards he could judge, but undeniably metal that could be worked and shaped and would not shatter like volcanic glass. This alone made the journey worthwhile. Proof that the survivors had not lied. Proof that other peoples had solved problems the Mexica had not yet mastered. The Arab trader sat across from them, studying them with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living reading strangers and determining value. He was perhaps 40 years old. His skin was lighter than the local people, but darker than the pale strangers the survivors had described farther north. He wore a robe of finer cloth than anyone else in the village. Around his neck hung a pendant with symbols the Mexica did not recognize. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful. Through gestures and repetition, a crude vocabulary began to form. The trader pointed to himself and said a word that sounded like Ibrahim. The Mexica understood this was a name. Tlacaelel pointed to himself and said his own name slowly. Ibrahim repeated it, mangling the Nahuatl syllables, but making an honest attempt. They continued. Water, food, ship, sky, sun, moon. The building blocks of meaning. Ibrahim called for something, and a young boy ran off and returned with a sack. From it, the trader pulled objects wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped them one by one, watching the Mexica's reactions. A small knife of iron. A length of fabric dyed in colors achieved through techniques unknown in the Americas. Glass beads, crude but perfectly transparent in a way obsidian could never be. And then, something that made Tlacaelel lean forward with sudden intensity. A book, not a codex made of bark paper like the ones the Mexica used. This was bound in leather, with pages of something thinner than any material Tlacaelel had seen used for writing. The symbols on the pages were incomprehensible, flowing and connected in ways that suggested not pictures but pure sound made visible. This was writing abstracted to its essence, an alphabet, though Tlacaelel had no word for such a concept. He gestured to his own bag and pulled out his codex, the bark paper book where he had recorded the journey. Ibrahim's eyes widened. He took the codex carefully, reverently almost, and examined the pages. The pictographic writing, the astronomical tables, the calculations of sun angles and star positions. He spent long minutes on a single page that showed the movement of Venus across multiple cycles. Then he looked up at Tlacaelel and said something in Arabic that the Mexica did not understand, but whose tone conveyed respect. Ibrahim called for more people. A discussion began in the local language, rapid and animated. The Mexica waited, understanding nothing but reading the body language. These people were deciding something important. Whether to help, whether to trade, whether to trust these strange visitors who had arrived from the impossible direction of the sunset. Finally, the village elder spoke directly to Tlacaelel through Ibrahim's translation, which came in fragments of gesture and the few shared words they had established. The meaning that emerged was this. They would provide food and shelter for a time. They would help repair the ships. But in return, they wanted to understand. Where had these people come from? How had they crossed the ocean? And what did they want? Tlacaelel considered how to answer. Through Ibrahim, through drawings in the sand, through the slow, painful construction of shared meaning, he tried to explain. A city on a lake, mountains that smoked, an empire of millions, a calendar that predicted the movements of stars, a decision to see what lay beyond the Eastern Ocean. He did not mention conquest. He did not mention gods or destiny or manifest purpose. He spoke only of curiosity and trade and the simple human desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. The explanation took hours. The sun moved across the sky outside. More villagers gathered to listen and stare at these strange men with their copper skin and their obsidian blades and their stories of a world across the sea. Some were skeptical. Some were fascinated. All were uncertain what this meant for their small village on the edge of the known world. When Tlacaelel finished, Ibrahim spoke for a long time in Arabic to the village elder. Then he turned to the Mexica and through gestures made them understand something crucial. This land, where they had arrived, was not the end. It was the beginning. To the north lay other lands, other peoples, kingdoms of pale-skinned strangers who commanded iron and horses and ships larger than anything the Mexica had built. These northern kingdoms were powerful and dangerous and greedy. If the Mexica wished to meet them, Ibrahim could guide them along the coast. But he warned them. The people of the north were not like the villagers here. They were not simple fishermen. They were traders and warriors and priests of a jealous god who tolerated no rivals. Tlacaelel understood the warning. But he had not crossed an ocean to stop at the first shore. He had come to find the edge of the world, and he had learned that the world had no edge. Only more world. Always more. And somewhere in that vastness lay knowledge and power and possibilities that could transform Tenochtitlan from a city on a lake to something far greater. Over the following days, a routine established itself. The Mexica rested and recovered their strength. The ships were repaired with help from local fishermen who knew how to work with wood damaged by salt water. Food was shared. The crude vocabulary between Nahuatl and Arabic and the local Wolof tongue expanded word by word. The Mexica demonstrated their own goods. Cacao beans, which the locals had never seen and which Ibrahim recognized as valuable. Obsidian blades, which were examined with appreciation for their sharpness even if iron was more durable. Jade and featherwork and small pieces of gold that made Ibrahim's eyes light with the universal expression of a merchant recognizing profit. But the most important exchange was not of goods, but of ideas. Tlacaelel showed Ibrahim his astronomical calculations. The Arab trader, who had traveled to cities where scholars studied the stars, understood enough to recognize sophistication when he saw it. These were not savages who had stumbled across the ocean by accident. These were people with science, with learning, with systems of knowledge that might rival anything in Fez or Cairo or Baghdad. And Ibrahim, in turn, told them about the world beyond, about the great desert that stretched across the interior, about the kingdoms of Mali and Songhai, where gold flowed like water and scholars debated in universities, about the Mediterranean, where ships from a dozen nations traded and fought and spread their gods and languages, about Europa, the land of the pale people, where kingdoms rose and fell, and a new hunger for expansion was beginning to stir. Tlacaelel listened and understood that they had not discovered a new world. They had stumbled into a very old one, a world with its own empires and conflicts and history, stretching back millennia. A world that had been turning and changing and evolving while the Americas developed in isolation. The question now was not whether to engage with this world. They had already crossed that threshold. The question was how to engage with it. As equals, as supplicants, as conquerors, or as something else entirely. On the 10th day after their arrival, Tlacaelel made his decision. They would continue north. Ibrahim had agreed to accompany them as translator and guide in exchange for a share of the trade goods and the promise of future commerce. Some of the Mexica would remain here, too weak to continue or too fearful of what lay ahead. But most would go on. They had not come this far to turn back before seeing the full scope of what the Eastern world contained. The night before they departed, the village held a feast. Fish and grain and fruits the Mexica had never tasted. Music played on drums and stringed instruments whose sounds were foreign but not unpleasant. The barrier between the two peoples had not dissolved, but it had thinned. They were still strangers. But they were strangers who had shared food and water and the basic recognition that despite different languages and different gods and different histories, they were all human, all trying to survive, all curious about the other. As Tlacaelel lay on a mat that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an African village settling into sleep, he thought about what he would tell the emperor when he returned. If he returned, he thought about how to explain that the world was not what they had believed, that the gods had not placed Tenochtitlan at the center of creation, that there were other cities, other empires, other peoples who had never heard of the Mexica and who would not automatically bow to their supremacy. This knowledge was dangerous. It could shake the foundations of everything the empire was built upon, but it was also liberating. If the world was larger than they knew, then the Mexica could be larger too. They could learn from these strangers, adopt their iron, study their writing, trade their goods, and in doing so, become something new, something that could stand as equals in this wider world. Or they could try to conquer it, bring the light of Huitzilopochtli to lands that worshipped different gods, establish tribute from peoples who had never paid tribute to anyone, expand the empire beyond the ocean to shores no Mexica had imagined existed. Both paths lay open. Both were possible. And the choice, Tlacaelel realized, would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he had left behind in the city on the lake. The fate of millions who did not yet know that the world had changed. That history had split. That a new age was beginning whether they were ready for it or not. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow they would sail north. Toward the Pale Kingdoms. Toward the next threshold. Toward whatever came next. The ocean had been crossed. The hard part was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Northern Journey. The journey north took longer than Tlacaelel had anticipated. Not because of distance, though the coast seemed to stretch endlessly, but because Ibrahim insisted they stop at each settlement. The Arab trader understood something the Mexica did not yet grasp. In this part of the world, you did not simply sail past people. You announced yourself. You paid respects. You established that you came in peace and sought trade, not war. To do otherwise was to invite arrows or worse. So they stopped. Village after village. Some barely more than clusters of fishing huts. Others larger, with markets and mosques and the kind of organized activity that suggested connection to something greater inland. At each stop, the pattern repeated. The ships would approach slowly. Warriors would tense. Ibrahim would call out in Arabic or Berber or whatever local tongue he knew. There would be a pause, a negotiation, and eventually permission to land. The Mexica learned quickly that their appearance caused a sensation everywhere they went. The copper skin, the feather cloaks, though bedraggled from months at sea, the obsidian weapons that caught light like black ice, the strange boats that looked nothing like the dhows and feluccas that normally plied these waters. Children followed them through villages. Old men studied them and debated what they might be. Demons from the west. Traders from some unknown kingdom. Survivors of a shipwreck who had drifted from impossibly far away. Ibrahim did not tell the full truth. Not yet. He explained that these men came from lands far to the west, that they sought trade routes and knowledge, that they carried goods worth examining. This much was true. But he did not mention how far west, did not mention an ocean crossing, did not mention empires and pyramids and cities on lakes. Some truths were too large to be believed without preparation. The trade began in earnest. Cacao beans were the revelation Ibrahim had predicted. Once people tasted the bitter drink, once they understood it could be sweetened with honey or mixed with spices, demand exploded. In a village near what would one day be called Morocco, a local merchant offered 10 iron knives for a single pound of cacao. Tlacaelel made the trade and understood immediately the implications. If cacao commanded such value here, and if iron could be obtained so cheaply, then a trade route between the Americas and Africa could make Tenochtitlan wealthier than any amount of tribute from conquered cities. But it was not just goods that exchanged hands. Knowledge flowed in both directions. A physician in one village examined the herbs the Mexica carried and recognized some, while others were utterly foreign. He offered his own remedies in return: powders for fever, salves for wounds, techniques for setting broken bones that the Mexica physicians studied with intense interest. In another town, a scholar who could read and write Arabic spent an entire day examining Tlacaelel's codex. Through Ibrahim's translation, he explained that while the Mexica system was pictographic, it was sophisticated. It encoded not just objects but sounds and concepts. It was, in its own way, as legitimate as Arabic script. This validation mattered to Tlacaelel more than he wanted to admit. Part of him had feared that the Eastern world would look upon the Mexica as primitives, children playing at civilization while the real adults conducted the business of empire and learning. But the scholar's respect, grudging though it was, suggested otherwise. Different did not mean inferior. The Mexica had achieved things these people had not, just as these people had achieved things the Mexica had not. The question was whether they could learn from each other or whether they would only try to dominate. As they traveled north, the landscape changed. The tropical vegetation gave way to scrubland and then to rockier coast. The villages grew larger and more fortified. They were approaching the Mediterranean, the crossroads of the Old World, the place where Europe and Africa and Asia met and traded and fought and mixed their peoples and gods and ambitions. Ibrahim became more cautious. He explained that the northern kingdoms were different. The Mali and Songhai to the south were powerful, yes, but they were trading empires. They understood negotiation and exchange. The European kingdoms were younger, hungrier, more volatile. They had recently expelled the Moors from Iberia after centuries of conflict. They were flush with religious fervor and looking for new enemies, new conquests, new ways to expand their power and spread their faith. When we meet them, Ibrahim said through the broken mixture of Arabic and Nahuatl and gesture that now served as their common tongue, do not show weakness. They respect strength, but also do not threaten. They are quick to violence when afraid. You must be like water, strong enough to carve stone, but fluid enough to flow around obstacles. Tlacaelel understood. He had played similar games in Tenochtitlan's court. Politics was politics, whether in the Valley of Mexico or the Mediterranean. The powerful needed to be approached with the right mixture of deference and confidence. Too much of either invited disaster. On a morning in early autumn, by the European calendar it would have been September of 1460, they rounded a rocky headland and saw it. The Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Africa and Europe, the gateway to the Mediterranean. Even from a distance, the geography was dramatic. Two great rocks, one on each side of the strait, standing like pillars holding up the sky. The Moors called them the Pillars of Hercules. Ancient myth given geographic form. Ibrahim pointed across the water to the northern shore. There, he said, Iberia, the land of the Christians. The kingdom of Castile to the west. Aragon to the east. Portugal on the Atlantic coast. They are separate but allied. They share a religion and a hatred of anything that is not them. Tlacaelel studied the far shore through the morning haze. It looked no different from the African side. Rocky hills, sparse vegetation, signs of human habitation. But this was Europe, the land the original survivors had only heard about in stories. The source of the iron and the horses and the strange religion that worshipped a man nailed to wood. We should land on the African side first, Ibrahim counseled. Prepare. Rest. Decide how to approach them. The Christians are not like the villagers we have met. They will have soldiers, priests, men who will want to know everything about you and will not stop asking until they have answers. But Tlacaelel shook his head. They had not come this far to hesitate at the final threshold. We cross now, he said. We meet them as we are, exhausted, honest, seeking trade and knowledge. If they are as dangerous as you say, then caution will not save us. Only boldness will make them pause long enough to listen. Ibrahim looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was the smile of a merchant who recognized a gambler who understood the odds and was willing to play anyway. Very well, he said. But when they throw us in chains or put us on trial for heresy or witchcraft, I will remind you that I warned against this. They crossed the strait in the afternoon. The wind was favorable, and the passage was calm. The ships moved through water that had been sailed by Phoenicians and Greeks and Romans and Carthaginians and Arabs, and now, for the first time in human history, by men from across the Atlantic. If the ocean remembered those who travelled it, then surely it noticed this moment. This crossing, this small but significant breach in the wall that had separated east from west for all of human existence, the European shore received them without ceremony. A small fishing village, perhaps 40 people. Poor, remote, the kind of place that existed on the margins of kingdoms and paid its taxes and asked only to be left alone. The ships pulled onto a beach of grey sand. The men disembarked, and for the first time, warriors of the Mexica stood on European soil. The villagers emerged from their houses slowly, fishermen clutching nets, women holding children, an old man who might have been the elder or priest or simply the one brave enough to approach. They stared at the Mexica with expressions that cycled through fear and confusion and curiosity. They had never seen people like this. Never imagined people like this existed. Ibrahim stepped forward and spoke in what he explained was Castilian Spanish, a language he had learned from merchants and prisoners during his years of trading. His accent was thick and his vocabulary limited, but it was enough. He explained that they were traders from distant lands, that they sought audience with whoever governed this region, that they came in peace and carried goods worth examining. The old man listened. Then he spoke rapidly in the same language. Ibrahim translated back to Tlacaelel in their broken hybrid tongue. He says this village belongs to a lord who lives inland. A day's walk. He says we should wait here while he sends word. He says. Ibrahim paused, searching for the right words. He says we should pray to our gods that the Lord is in a generous mood, because he has the power to welcome us or kill us, and it will depend entirely on his whim. Tlacaelel nodded. It was the same in Tenochtitlan. Power was arbitrary. The powerful did as they pleased, and the weak endured. This, at least, was a universal truth. Tell him we will wait, Tlacaelel said. Tell him we bring gifts for his lord. And tell him that where we come from, those who offer hospitality to strangers are blessed by the gods. Perhaps the same is true here. The message was relayed. The old man seemed to consider this. Then he nodded and sent a young boy running inland toward whatever lay beyond the hills. And the Mexica settled in to wait on a European beach, under a European sky, for a European lord to decide their fate. The lord arrived 2 days later, with an escort of 20 mounted men. The Mexica saw them coming from a distance. Riders on horses, which most of the crew had never seen before except in Ibrahim's descriptions. The animals were enormous, far larger than deer, moving with a power that was both beautiful and terrifying. The men who rode them wore metal. Not just weapons, but clothing made of metal. Armor that covered them from head to foot, glinting in the afternoon sun. Tlacaelel watched them approach and understood immediately that this was theatre, a display of power. The Lord could have come alone or with a small retinue. Instead, he brought soldiers in full armor on war horses to remind these strangers that he commanded violence should he choose to use it. It was the same tactic Mexican nobles used when receiving tribute from conquered cities. Show them the warriors. Make them remember who holds the obsidian blade. The riders stopped 50 paces from where the Mexica had made camp. One man dismounted. He was perhaps 30 years old, wearing armor that was clearly expensive, decorated with engravings and symbols the Mexica did not recognize. A large cross hung on a chain around his neck. His face was pale, as the survivors had described, with a beard trimmed to a point and eyes that studied the Mexica with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. Ibrahim stepped forward and bowed. Not deeply, but enough to show respect without suggesting submission. He spoke in Spanish. The conversation that followed was long and complicated. The Lord asked questions. Ibrahim answered. Sometimes he turned to Tlacaelel for confirmation of details. Sometimes he invented answers that seemed more believable than the truth. The Mexica warriors stood behind their leader, hands near their weapons, watching the mounted soldiers who watched them in return. Both sides tense. Both sides ready for violence if it came. Both sides hoping it would not. Finally, Ibrahim turned to Tlacaelel. His name is Don Fernando de Guzman. He is lord of this coastal region under the authority of the King of Castile. He wants to know where we come from, what we want, and why we look like no people he has ever seen or heard of. Tell him the truth, Tlacaelel said, or enough of it to satisfy him. We come from lands far to the west across the ocean. We are explorers and traders. We seek knowledge and commerce. We mean no harm to him or his people. Ibrahim translated. Don Fernando listened. Then he spoke again, his tone sharp with what sounded like skepticism, or perhaps mockery. Ibrahim translated back. He says that no lands lie to the west, only ocean. He says that if we truly cross the ocean, we must be either blessed by God or in league with the devil. He wants to know which. It was a trap disguised as a question. Tlacaelel recognized it immediately. Claim divine blessing, and they might be seen as heretics claiming false miracles. Admit to any association with this devil, and they would be killed immediately. The only safe answer was deflection. Tell him we are men, nothing more. We do not presume to understand the will of gods or devils. We built ships and sailed east, and survived. If that required blessing, then we were blessed. If it required only skill and fortune, then we had both. The answer seemed to satisfy Don Fernando, or at least not offend him enough to order an immediate attack. He spoke again at length. Ibrahim translated in pieces. He says he will take us to his castle. We will be his guests, which means we will be watched and questioned, but not harmed unless we give him reason. He wants to see our goods, our ships, our weapons. He wants to understand what manner of men we are. And Ibrahim hesitated. He says his priest will want to speak with us about our souls. Tlacaelel had expected this. Ibrahim had warned that European religion was aggressive in a way that Mexica religion was not. The Christians believed their God was the only God, that all other gods were demons or delusions. That conversion was not just desirable but mandatory. This would be delicate. The Mexica could not afford to anger these people, but neither could they simply abandon their own gods. Not without losing the respect of their own men and the blessing of the divine powers they believed protected them. Tell him we welcome the opportunity to learn about his God, Tlacaelel said carefully, and that we hope he will show us the same courtesy of listening to our beliefs. We do not come to convert or be converted. We come to understand. The translation was made. Don Fernando's expression was unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Orders were given. The Mexica were to follow the mounted escort inland to the castle. The ships would remain on the beach under guard. Half the crew would stay with them. The other half, including Tlacaelel, would be guests of the Lord. The word guest hung in the air with all its ambiguity. Honored visitor or polite prisoner. It would depend entirely on how the next few days unfolded. The castle was smaller than Tlacaelel had imagined. Not a vast complex like the palaces of Tenochtitlan, but a fortified structure of stone perched on a hillside overlooking the coast. Walls thick enough to resist siege. Towers from which archers could command the approaches. A single gate that could be sealed and defended. It was built for war, not beauty. A statement in stone that said, "Here lives a man who takes what he can hold and holds what he has taken." Inside, the Mexica were given a large room in one of the towers. Comfortable enough, with rushes on the floor and narrow windows that let in light and air. But the door was thick wood bound with iron, and guards stood outside. Guests, yes, but guests who would not be allowed to wander freely. That night, they were brought to the great hall for a feast. The room was dominated by a long wooden table where Don Fernando sat at the head. His wife was there, pale and silent, dressed in heavy layers of cloth despite the warmth. His children, his senior knights, a priest in black robes who studied the Mexica with eyes that burned with a different kind of hunger than the merchants. This was a man who sought not gold, but souls. The food was strange. Bread made from wheat, which the Mexica had never tasted. Meat that Ibrahim identified as pork and mutton. Cheese, which some of the Mexica found fascinating, and others found repulsive. Wine, which was like pulque but sharper, made from grapes instead of maguey. The Mexica ate cautiously, trying not to show their unease, aware that every gesture was being watched and judged. Don Fernando spoke through Ibrahim, who sat between the two groups performing his role as bridge and translator. "I have heard many strange tales in my life," the Lord said, "but none stranger than yours. Men who claim to have crossed the Western Ocean. Where did you build these ships? Who taught you to sail? And why should I believe you come from anything other than some unknown island or the coast of Africa?" Tlacaelel had prepared for this. He gestured to one of his men, who brought forward a wrapped bundle. Inside was the codex. The bark paper book with its astronomical tables and pictographic records of the journey. He laid it before Don Fernando and opened it to a page showing the movements of Venus over multiple cycles. "This is our calendar," Tlacaelel said through Ibrahim's translation. "It predicts the movements of the sky with precision. We use it to time our plantings and our festivals and our wars. If you have scholars who study the stars, show them this. They will tell you whether our knowledge is real or invented." Don Fernando examined the codex with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. The priest leaned over his shoulder, studying the strange symbols and diagrams. They spoke in rapid Spanish. Finally, Don Fernando looked up. "My priest says this could be the work of demons, that no Christian nation uses such symbols, that it resembles nothing in God's creation. And yet it works," Tlacaelel said calmly. "The stars move as we predict they will. The seasons turn as our calendar says they must. If that is the work of demons, then demons understand creation better than men." It was a dangerous thing to say. The priest's face darkened, but Don Fernando laughed. A short, sharp bark of amusement. "Careful, stranger. In this land, such words can get you burned." But he studied Tlacaelel more closely. You do not speak like a savage. You reason like a scholar, which makes you either more dangerous or more valuable than I first thought. The conversation continued through the evening. Don Fernando asked about their voyage. Tlacaelel described it in general terms, emphasizing the currents and winds, the techniques of navigation, the careful rationing of supplies. He did not mention the full extent of Tenochtitlan's power, did not describe a city of 200,000, did not speak of empires or tribute or pyramids. Let them think the Mexica were from some small kingdom. Let them underestimate. Underestimation was safer than awe or fear. In return, Don Fernando spoke of Europe, of the recent victory over the Moors, of the unity of the Christian kingdoms, of a world that was beginning to look beyond its own borders. He spoke of rumors from the east, of Ottoman Turks threatening Constantinople, of trade routes being strangled and the need to find new paths to the spices and silk of Asia. The world is changing, he said. Power is shifting. Those who can navigate this change will thrive. Those who cannot will be swept aside. Tlacaelel heard the hunger in those words. This was a man of ambition, a minor lord in a minor region who dreamed of more. Perhaps that could be useful. Perhaps that hunger could be directed. We have goods to trade, Tlacaelel said. Things that do not exist in your lands. We seek things that do not exist in ours. Iron, steel, horses, knowledge of your weapons and ships. In exchange, we offer cacao, which you have not yet tasted, but which I promise will command a price in your markets. We offer obsidian, sharper than your finest blades. We offer maps of currents and winds that no European has ever charted. Don Fernando's eyes glinted. And what would you do with horses and steel? Build an army. Conquer your neighbors. Defend ourselves, Tlacaelel said. And yes, perhaps expand. As you have done, as every kingdom does when it has the means. Is that not the nature of power? To grow or to die? The Lord nodded slowly. This was language he understood. Ambition. Expansion. The logic of empire. We will discuss terms, he said. But first, my priest insists on speaking with you. About your beliefs. About your souls. In this land, commerce and salvation are not separate matters. We do not trade with heathens without first offering them the chance to know the true God. Tlacaelel had been dreading this, but there was no avoiding it. I will speak with your priest, he said, and I ask only that he listen as well as preach, that he seeks to understand before he seeks to convert. Don Fernando relayed this to the priest, who looked deeply unhappy but nodded curtly. The time was set for the next day, and that night, as Tlacaelel lay on an unfamiliar bed in a stone tower on the edge of Europe, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. If bringing the Mexica into contact with this world would prove to be not expansion but contamination, not growth but destruction, but it was too late to turn back. The ocean had been crossed. The two worlds had touched, and whatever came next would unfold whether he willed it or not. All he could do was try to guide it, try to ensure that when the Mexica met the Europeans as equals, they were strong enough and smart enough to survive the encounter. The conversation with the priest would determine much, perhaps everything, and Tlacaelel was not sure he was ready for it. But ready or not, dawn was coming, and with it, another threshold to cross. Chapter 4. The Return and Transformation. The meeting with the priest lasted 3 days, not because understanding was reached, but because neither side would yield the ground of their gods. Father Tomas, as he was called, was a Dominican friar, a member of an order known for their intellectual rigor and their zealous pursuit of heresy. He approached the Mexica not with kindness, but with the certainty of a man who believed he held absolute truth and that all deviation from it was demonic corruption. He asked about their gods. Tlacaelel answered honestly. Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war and sun. Tlaloc, the ancient rain god. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who brought knowledge. The priest listened with an expression that shifted between horror and fascination. When Tlacaelel mentioned sacrifice, the offering of blood to sustain the cosmos, Father Tomas stood abruptly and declared the conversation over. You worship demons, he said through Ibrahim's translation. You offer human souls to the devil himself. There can be no commerce with such people. no treaty, no friendship, only conversion or condemnation. But Don Fernando intervened. The Lord was more pragmatic than his priest. He saw opportunity where Father Tomas saw only abomination. "These men have crossed an ocean," he said to the priest. "They have knowledge of lands we did not know existed. They have goods that could make this region wealthy. I will not turn them away because their gods have different names than ours. Convert them if you can, Father. But first, let us learn what they know. Let us trade. Let us establish relations. Then, perhaps, they will see the wisdom of embracing the true faith." It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but allowed the conversation to continue. Over the following weeks, a cautious exchange began. The Mexica traded cacao and obsidian and detailed maps of the ocean currents they had followed. In return, they received iron tools, steel blades, and most precious of all, 3 horses. Not war horses. These were old plough animals, past their prime, deemed expendable. But to the Mexica, they were marvels. Creatures large enough to carry a man, strong enough to pull loads no human could manage, fast enough to cross distances in hours that would take days on foot. Don Fernando also provided them with European goods to study, examples of armor and weapons, books, though none of the Mexica could read them, seeds for wheat and barley and other crops that might grow in the Valley of Mexico, and knowledge. A blacksmith spent days teaching Tlacaelel the basics of ironworking, the furnaces and hammers and techniques that transformed ore into metal. It was crude instruction, barely sufficient to begin understanding the craft, but it was more than the Mexica had possessed before. In return, Tlacaelel taught what he could: astronomy and calendar calculations that impressed even the skeptical Europeans, agricultural techniques from the Chinampas, the properties of cacao and how to prepare it as a drink, and stories. Carefully edited stories about Tenochtitlan and the empire, downplaying the scale but emphasizing the sophistication. Let them think the Mexica were interesting. Let them think there was more to learn. But do not let them think there was a prize worth conquering. As spring approached in 1461, Tlacaelel knew it was time to leave. They had been in Europe for 6 months, long enough to learn much, long enough to establish that future contact was possible, but not so long that they wore out their welcome or revealed too much. The ships had been repaired and provisioned. The route back was known, and in Tenochtitlan, the emperor would be waiting for answers, for proof that the journey had been worthwhile, for the goods and knowledge that would justify the lives lost. The departure was formal. Don Fernando came to the beach to see them off. He gave Tlacaelel a letter, sealed with wax, written in Spanish. "When you return," he said through Ibrahim, "bring this to whatever king or lord rules your land. Tell him that Don Fernando de Guzman seeks friendship and trade between our peoples. Tell him that we are willing to negotiate terms. And tell him—" The Lord paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tell him that Europe is waking from a long sleep, that we are looking beyond our borders, that if he wishes his people to be partners rather than subjects when we come, he should prepare." It was both invitation and warning. Tlacaelel accepted the letter and gave one in return: a painted codex showing the route they had travelled and symbols representing the goods the Mexica could provide in future trade. Neither document would be fully understood by its recipient, but both would serve as proof that contact had been made, that a bridge had been built across the ocean. The journey back took 63 days. They knew the route now, knew the currents and winds, knew where to find the warm river in the sea that would carry them southwest toward Africa and then west toward the Caribbean. They stopped briefly at the West African village where they had first made landfall. The fishermen there greeted them with surprised joy, having assumed they had died in the northern lands. Ibrahim chose to remain here. He had guided them well, but he was a merchant at heart, and he saw better opportunities in establishing himself as the middleman between Africa and the Americas than in crossing the ocean again. "When your people return," he said to Tlacaelel, through their now familiar hybrid language, "I will be here. I will help them navigate these coasts. I will teach them Arabic and local tongues, and I will expect a fair share of the profit for my trouble." Tlacaelel agreed. Ibrahim had earned that much and more, and having an ally on this side of the ocean could prove invaluable when future expeditions came. And they would come. Of that, Tlacaelel was certain. The crossing back was easier than the voyage out. Fewer storms, better knowledge of what to expect. But it was not without cost. One ship developed a leak that could not be repaired. The crew and cargo were transferred to the other two vessels, and the damaged ship was scuttled with the same prayers they had offered before. 2 more men died of sickness. Old wounds from the outbound journey that had never fully healed. By the time they sighted the coast of the Yucatan, only 140 of the original 300 men remained alive. But they had survived. They had crossed the ocean twice. They had met the old world and returned to Telavet. And they carried with them proof. Iron tools and steel blades. 3 horses, thin from the voyage but alive. Seeds and books and samples of European cloth. And knowledge, maps and techniques, and a broader understanding of the world than any Mexica had ever possessed. When they finally reached Tenochtitlan in the autumn of 1461, the entire city turned out to witness their return. 3 ships where 6 had departed. Gaunt men who walked like ghosts. Strange animals that made children scream and adults stare. And at the center of it all, Tlacaelel the navigator, carrying a letter from a Spanish lord and a burden of knowledge that would change everything. The emperor, Moctezuma I, received him in the great palace. The throne room was filled with nobles and priests and warriors, all waiting to hear the story of the expedition that had been presumed lost. Tlacaelel told them everything. The ocean crossing, the storm, the landing in Africa, the journey to Europe, the meeting with Don Fernando, the iron and horses and the people with pale skin who worshipped a god nailed to wood. When he finished, there was silence. Then the emperor spoke. "You have done what you promised. You have found the eastern lands. You have brought back proof. But—" he paused. "You have also brought back something else. Something I see in your eyes. Fear." Tlacaelel did not deny it. "Yes, my lord. Fear. Because the Eastern world is not empty. It is full of peoples and kingdoms and empires as complex as our own. And they are looking outward. They are building ships. They are hungry for new lands and new conquests. If we do nothing, they will eventually come to us. And when they do, if we have not prepared, they will destroy us." The emperor considered this. "Then we will prepare. You will teach our smiths to work iron. You will breed these horses and create herds. You will train navigators in the routes you have learned. And when the time is right, we will send another expedition. Larger, better equipped, not just to trade, but to establish permanent relations, to make sure that when the Europeans come to our shores, they find us ready." It was the response Tlacaelel had hoped for. But as he left the throne room and walked through the city he had not seen in over 2 years, he felt the weight of what was coming. They would prepare. They would grow stronger. But would it be enough? That night, alone in his house with his family sleeping nearby, Tlacaelel felt something he had not experienced during the entire voyage. Not during the storms or the hunger or the meeting with strange peoples. He felt the first symptoms. A slight fever. A tightness in his chest. Nothing serious. Just fatigue from the journey, he told himself. He would rest. He would recover. And then he would begin the work of preparing his people for the future that was rushing toward them like a wave they could not stop, only hope to survive. The disease came quietly at first. Tlacaelel's fever broke after 3 days, and he assumed he had recovered. But others were not so fortunate. Within a week of the expedition's return, 5 men from the crew developed symptoms far worse than his had been. High fever, chills, a rash that spread across their bodies in painful pustules. The physicians treated them with traditional remedies, herbs and bloodletting and prayers. 2 men recovered. 3 died. It was unfortunate but not alarming. Men died from sickness. This was the way of the world. But then others fell ill. People who had never been on the ships. People who had attended the celebrations welcoming the expedition home. Market vendors who had examined the European goods. Families who had embraced the returning sailors. Children who had touched the horses with curious hands. Within 2 weeks, 50 people were sick. Within a month, 500. The disease spread through Tenochtitlan like fire through dry grass, and the physicians had no cure for it. They tried everything. Every herb in their considerable pharmacopoeia. Every prayer to every god. Every ritual that had ever worked against sickness. Nothing stopped it. The fever came and the rash followed, and people either survived or they did not, and there seemed to be no pattern to who lived and who died. The priests consulted the sacred calendar and determined that this was a punishment from the gods for some transgression. But no one could agree on what transgression or how to appease the divine anger. Some said it was punishment for crossing the ocean, for venturing into realms that belonged to other gods. Others said it was a test, a trial that would purify the Mexica and make them stronger. Still others whispered that the Europeans had cursed them, that this was a weapon more terrible than any steel blade. Tlacaelel knew what the priest did not. He had seen sickness in Europe, had heard Ibrahim speak of diseases that swept through cities, killing thousands before burning themselves out. The Europeans lived with such plagues. Their bodies had learned to fight them over generations. But here in the Americas, where these diseases had never existed, the people had no defense. Their bodies did not know how to recognize the invisible enemy, did not know how to build the barriers that would stop it. He reported this understanding to the emperor. Moctezuma listened with growing horror. "How many will die?" he asked. "I do not know," Tlacaelel admitted. "In Europe, such diseases kill many, but not all. Those who survive cannot catch the same sickness again. Their bodies remember. But here, where no one has ever faced this before..." He trailed off, unable to finish the terrible calculation. The emperor made a decision. Quarantine. The sick were to be isolated in special compounds outside the city. No one was to enter or leave the quarantine zones without permission. Markets were shut down. Public gatherings forbidden. The great festivals that marked the calendar were cancelled. Tenochtitlan, the city that never slept, fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the songs of priests and the wailing of mourners. The quarantine helped, but not enough. The disease had spread too far before anyone understood what was happening. It moved through the city in waves, striking one neighborhood and then another. It followed the causeways into the surrounding towns and villages. It traveled with merchants and warriors and tribute bearers into distant provinces. By the time the epidemic began to subside, a full year after the expedition's return, the count was devastating. 12,000 dead in Tenochtitlan alone. Perhaps 30,000 throughout the Valley of Mexico. One person in 10. Families destroyed. Entire neighborhoods left empty. The chinampas untended because there were not enough hands to work them. The temples echoing because half the priests were dead or caring for the dying. The psychological impact was worse than the death toll. The people understood now that contact with the Eastern world brought not just iron and horses and knowledge, but invisible death. The expedition, which had been celebrated as a triumph, was now viewed with suspicion and fear. Some priests called for the European goods to be destroyed, for the horses to be killed, for the ships to be burned, for all knowledge of the Eastern world to be erased and forgotten as if the ocean had never been crossed. Tlacaelel fought against this with every breath he had left. He was weak now, never having fully recovered from his own bout with the fever, but his mind was sharp and his voice still carried weight. He argued in council chambers and temple courtyards and anywhere anyone would listen. "We cannot unknow what we know," he said. "The disease came because we were unprepared, because we did not understand what we were bringing back. But now we do understand. Those who survived the fever cannot catch it again. I have seen this. The crew members who recovered in Europe did not fall sick here. Their bodies learned, and their children will inherit that learning. That strength." He paused to catch his breath, then continued. "If we isolate ourselves now, if we pretend the Eastern world does not exist, then when the Europeans eventually come here on their own, we will be as helpless as we were this time. The disease will come again, carried by their ships, and we will have no immunity, no preparation, no defense. But if we continue contact, if we control it carefully and deliberately, we can build that immunity over time. We can prepare our bodies the same way we prepare our warriors, through controlled exposure, through training, through sacrifice, yes, but sacrifice with purpose." It was a hard argument to make to people who had just burned their children on funeral pyres, to mothers who had lost entire families, to priests who saw the hand of angry gods rather than invisible seeds of sickness. But slowly, over months of debate and demonstration, Tlacaelel's position prevailed. The turning point came when physicians documented what Tlacaelel had claimed, that those who survived the fever did not catch it again, that children born to survivors seemed stronger, more resistant, that immunity was real and could be inherited. This was not theology or philosophy, but observable fact. And facts, eventually, were harder to deny than fear. The emperor decreed that contact with the Eastern world would continue, but with strict new protocols. Future expeditions would be quarantined upon return. Sailors would live in isolation for 40 days before being allowed back into the city. Trade would be conducted at designated coastal ports, not in the heart of Tenochtitlan. And most importantly, they would accelerate their efforts to master European technology while managing the risk of disease. "We will learn from this tragedy," Moctezuma declared. "We will become stronger. The gods have tested us, and we have survived. Now we will show them that we are worthy of the fifth sun, that we can adapt, that we can face the Eastern world not as victims but as equals." It was a bold vision. But as Tlacaelel lay in his house recovering from the fever that never quite left him, he wondered if it was enough. The Europeans had had centuries to build immunity to their diseases. The Mexica had had one terrible year. The gap was vast, and time was running out. But they had survived. That counted for something. And survival, he had learned during 50 days at sea, was often just the first step towards something greater. The years that followed the Great Plague were years of transformation. Tenochtitlan rebuilt. The dead were mourned, and then remembered, and then gradually, as the living always do, incorporated into stories that gave meaning to suffering. The epidemic became part of the city's history. A trial survived. A price paid for knowledge. And the knowledge was put to use. The 3 horses that had survived the voyage became the foundation of a breeding program. It was difficult at first. The Mexica had no tradition of animal husbandry beyond dogs and turkeys. The horses required different food, different care, different understanding. But they learned. Within 5 years there were 12 horses. Within 10 years, 40. Young warriors competed for the privilege of learning to ride. New tactics were developed. The Mexica cavalry was crude compared to European knights, but it existed, and it improved with each generation. The ironworking proved more challenging. The Mexica had no tradition of high-temperature metallurgy. The furnaces required to melt iron, the techniques of forging and tempering, the entire infrastructure of a metalworking industry had to be built from nothing. Tlacaelel's notes from watching the Spanish blacksmith were helpful, but insufficient. The few iron tools they had brought back were studied and reverse-engineered with mixed results. But gradually, through trial and error, and the kind of focused effort that only comes from knowing your survival depends on it, they made progress. By 1470, a decade after the first expedition, Tenochtitlan had 5 working forges. The iron they produced was not as good as European steel. The blades were brittle, the tools crude, but they were metal, and metal did not shatter like obsidian. It could be resharpened. It lasted, and with each passing year, the quality improved. The shipbuilding advanced faster. The Mexica already understood boats. The challenges of working with wood and reading currents, and designing hulls that could survive rough water. Scaling up from canoes to ocean-going vessels was difficult but not impossible. They studied the European ships they had seen, made drawings, built models, tested designs on Lake Texcoco before committing to full construction. By 1475, 15 years after the first expedition, they had built 8 new ships, larger and more robust than the originals. With multiple masts and proper rigging and hulls designed for the Atlantic crossing, they were still not as sophisticated as European caravels, but they were seaworthy. They could carry more cargo, more men. And they incorporated lessons learned from the first voyage about storms and currents and the 1,000 details that meant the difference between survival and drowning. But perhaps the most important development was linguistic. Scribes studied the Spanish books that had been brought back. Over the years, a few European sailors had been shipwrecked on American shores and made their way to Tenochtitlan. Some were kept as prisoners. Others, seeing opportunity, chose to stay. They taught Spanish, explained Latin, decoded the mysterious alphabet that could represent pure sound rather than pictures. A young priest named Cuauhtemoc became particularly skilled at this. He learned to read Spanish well enough to understand basic texts. He learned to write it well enough to compose letters. And he trained others. By 1475, Tenochtitlan had a cadre of translators. Not many, perhaps 20 men, who could function in both languages. But 20 was infinitely more than zero. 20 meant that when the next expedition went east, they would not need to rely on intermediaries like Ibrahim. They could speak directly to the Europeans. And in diplomacy, direct communication was power. In 1476, 16 years after Tlacaelel's return, the second great expedition was ready. 12 ships this time. 600 men. Warriors and priests and merchants and scholars and physicians. They carried cacao and jade and gold and obsidian. They carried letters from the emperor to the kings of Spain and Portugal and the sultans of North Africa. They carried gifts and maps and the clear message that the Mexica were not primitives to be pitied or conquered, but a civilization to be negotiated with. Tlacaelel was too old to lead this expedition. His health had never fully recovered from the fever. He was 57 years old, which was ancient by Mexica standards. He walked with a cane. His hands shook. But his mind remained sharp and his vision clear. The honor of leading the second expedition went to his son, Chimalpopoca, who had been 20 years old during the first voyage and was now 36, trained from youth in navigation and diplomacy and the delicate art of meeting foreigners as neither master nor servant, but as equal. The departure was grander than the first had been. The entire city turned out. The emperor himself blessed the ships. Priests performed elaborate ceremonies asking for the favor of all the gods, but especially Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who ruled the wind, and Tlaloc, who controlled the rain. The fleet carried not just goods but also 5 of the epidemic survivors, men whose bodies had learned to fight the European diseases, and who could, the physicians hoped, help protect the rest of the crew through some mechanism no one fully understood but which observation suggested was real. As the ships moved across Lake Texcoco toward the eastern causeway, Tlacaelel stood in the same spot where he had stood 16 years earlier, watching his own expedition depart. But this time he was a spectator rather than a participant. This time he would wait in Tenochtitlan and wonder and hope and pray that his son would return where so many others had not. The expedition followed the same route, down to the coast, out into the Caribbean, east and north into the Atlantic. They knew where they were going now, knew the currents and winds, knew to expect storms around the 30th day, knew to watch for birds as signs of approaching land. The ocean was still dangerous, still capable of killing the unwary or unlucky, but it was no longer unknown. It had been mapped, understood, mastered as much as any ocean could be mastered. They made landfall in West Africa after 51 days. Ibrahim was dead by then, but his sons had inherited his business and his role as intermediaries. They welcomed the Mexica as old trading partners. Negotiations were conducted in a mixture of Arabic and Nahuatl and the pidgin language that had developed between the two cultures. Goods were exchanged. Cacao for iron, jade for cloth, knowledge for knowledge. But the real mission was farther north. After 2 weeks in West Africa, the fleet continued up the coast to Iberia, to the same region where Tlacaelel had met Don Fernando. But 16 years had passed. Don Fernando was dead, killed in some minor war. Chimalpopoca did not fully understand. His son ruled now, a younger man who had heard stories of the strange visitors from the west but had never met them. The reception was different this time. Not fearful curiosity but calculated interest. The Spanish had spent 16 years thinking about the Mexica, debating what they represented, whether they were a curiosity or an opportunity, whether the lands they came from were worth the risk of exploration. The second expedition's arrival answered some of those questions and raised new ones. Chimalpopoca came bearing letters and gifts and proposals for formal treaties. He spoke Spanish well enough to communicate directly, though interpreters were still used for important negotiations. He presented himself not as a supplicant seeking favor, but as an ambassador representing a powerful empire that wished to establish mutually beneficial relations. The Spanish were impressed despite themselves. These were not the desperate, half-starved sailors who had arrived 16 years ago. These were well-equipped professionals representing an organized state. The ships, while still inferior to European caravels, were clearly the product of sophisticated engineering. The goods they brought, especially the cacao and the precisely worked obsidian, commanded high prices in Spanish markets. and the knowledge they possessed of ocean currents and navigation routes was valuable in its own right. Over the following months, agreements were reached. The Mexico would establish a permanent trading post on the West African coast. Spanish merchants would be allowed to send small expeditions to the Caribbean to purchase cacao and other American goods. There would be no colonization, no military conquest, no forced conversion, just trade, carefully regulated, mutually profitable, a relationship between sovereign powers rather than conqueror and conquered. It was not perfect. Both sides held suspicions. Both sides prepared for the possibility that the other would betray the agreements. But it was a beginning, a framework that recognized the Mexica as legitimate players in the expanding web of global commerce rather than as resources to be exploited. When Chimalpopoca returned to Tenochtitlan in 1478, he brought more than trade goods. He brought a Spanish envoy, the first European to visit the Americas as a diplomatic guest rather than a shipwrecked sailor or prisoner. The man's name was Diego Alvarez, and he was a younger son of a minor noble family who had volunteered for this dangerous mission because it offered opportunities that would never be available to him in Spain. Diego spent 6 months in Tenochtitlan. He learned Nahuatl. He studied the calendar and astronomy. He marveled at the floating gardens and the engineering of the causeways and the scale of the city, which was indeed larger than most European capitals. And he wrote detailed reports that he would carry back to Spain. Reports that described not savages living in huts, but a sophisticated urban civilization with its own sciences and arts and systems of governance. These reports would change how Europe viewed the Americas. Not completely, not immediately, but enough to introduce doubt into the narrative of European superiority. Enough to suggest that the peoples of the New World might be partners rather than subjects. Enough to alter the trajectory of history in small but significant ways. Tlacaelel died in the winter of 1479, 3 months after his son returned from the second expedition. He was 58 years old. He had lived long enough to see his vision vindicated, to know that the ocean could be crossed not once but repeatedly, that trade was possible, that the Mexico could meet the Europeans as equals rather than victims. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family, having achieved more than most men dared to dream. His funeral was attended by thousands. The emperor himself gave the eulogy, calling Tlacaelel the man who had opened the world, who had proven that the Mexica could go anywhere, learn anything, survive everything. His body was cremated with full honors, and his ashes were interred in a place of honor near the Templo Mayor. Future generations would remember him as the navigator, the man who changed history by refusing to believe that the ocean was the edge of the world. But his work continued. The framework he had established, the networks he had built, the knowledge he had gathered, all of this lived on. Over the following decades, contact between the old world and the new became routine. Spanish ships visited the Caribbean regularly, trading European goods for American products. Mexican ships made the Atlantic crossing every few years, each expedition building on the knowledge of the last. The diseases continued to be a problem. Each new wave of contact brought new sicknesses. Measles, influenza, typhus. The death toll was terrible. By 1500, 40 years after the first expedition, the population of the Valley of Mexico had declined by perhaps 30% from its pre-contact peak. Entire villages were abandoned. Some cities shrank to shadows of their former selves. But it was not the apocalyptic 90% die-off that would occur in our timeline, because the contact was gradual rather than sudden, because the Mexica had time to develop partial immunity, because they understood quarantine and isolation and could manage outbreaks rather than being overwhelmed by them. The diseases killed many, but they did not destroy the civilization. And as the Mexica weakened from disease, they strengthened in other ways. By 1500, they had horses numbered in the thousands, cavalry units that could match European tactics if not European equipment. They had iron weapons in significant quantities, not as good as Spanish steel, but functional. They had firearms. Not many, just a few dozen, acquired through trade, and carefully studied, and slowly, painfully reverse-engineered. The matchlocks they produced were crude and unreliable, but they existed. They made noise and smoke and occasionally fired. And the knowledge of how to make them was spreading. Most importantly, they had knowledge. Diplomatic knowledge of European politics and alliances, geographic knowledge of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast, military knowledge of European tactics and strategies, linguistic knowledge that allowed direct communication without intermediaries. All of this made them formidable in ways that had nothing to do with population or technology. So, when Christopher Columbus petitioned the Spanish crown in 1492 for ships to sail west across the Atlantic in search of a route to Asia, he was told something unexpected. The ocean to the west was not unknown. It had been crossed, multiple times, by people from lands that already had trade agreements with Spain. If Columbus wanted to explore those lands, he would need to respect existing treaties. He would need to approach as a trader, not a conqueror. He would need permission. Columbus, ambitious and arrogant, did not like these restrictions. He petitioned other courts, Portugal, England, France. But word had spread. The lands to the west were inhabited by peoples who had their own kingdoms and laws and trading relationships, who had ships and weapons and could defend themselves, who had survived diseases and built immunity, who were not prizes waiting to be claimed but powers to be negotiated with. Some Europeans still dreamed of conquest. Of course they did. Ambition and greed did not disappear just because the victims were prepared. But the calculation had changed. The risk was higher, the potential resistance greater, and the existing trade relationships were profitable enough that outright war seemed unnecessarily risky. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés would have landed on the coast of Mexico in our timeline, he instead arrived as part of a Spanish trading mission. He came with 5 ships and 200 men, yes, but he came as a merchant backed by the crown, not as a conquistador seeking plunder. He was met by Mexica officials who spoke Spanish and who escorted him to Tenochtitlan, not as invaders, but as trade representatives. The city he saw was not the one Cortés would have encountered in our timeline. This Tenochtitlan had been ravaged by disease. Its population was perhaps 140,000 rather than 200,000. But it still stood. The temples still rose. The Chinampas still produced food. The market still bustled. And the warriors who lined the causeways carried not just obsidian but steel, rode not just on foot but on horses, and knew from decades of contact what Europeans were capable of and how to defend against them. Cortés negotiated trade deals. He toured the city with a mixture of awe and frustration. Awe at the scale and sophistication. Frustration that there would be no easy conquest here. No gold simply waiting to be taken. No empire ripe for toppling with a few hundred men and superior weapons. These people had superior weapons too now, or at least adequate weapons. And they had allies and knowledge, and most importantly, they had survived the diseases that should have destroyed them. In 1533, when Francisco Pizarro would have conquered the Inca Empire in our timeline, he instead found something similar in the Andes. The Inca had been in contact with the Mexica for decades by then, had received warnings about Europeans, had acquired some horses and iron through trade, had experienced the diseases in smaller, more manageable waves rather than all at once. The empire was weaker than it had been, yes, but it was not collapsing. It was adapting. Pizarro, like Cortés, found that conquest was not a viable option. Not without reinforcements on a scale that Spain was unwilling to commit to wars so far from Europe against enemies who had proven they could fight back. So he traded instead. Gold and silver for European goods. Knowledge for knowledge. An uneasy relationship between imperial powers rather than the subjugation of one by the other. By the middle of the 16th century, the world looked different than it did in our timeline. There was no new world in the European sense. There were the Americas, inhabited by kingdoms and empires that had been shocked by contact with Europe, but had not been destroyed by it. That had paid a terrible price in disease, but had survived. That had adapted and learned and armed themselves. That existed as sovereign powers in an increasingly connected global system rather than as colonies of European empires. It was not a world of equality. The Europeans still had advantages in metallurgy and firearms and shipbuilding. The diseases still killed more Americans than Europeans. The balance of power still favored the old world. But it was not the overwhelming, crushing dominance of our timeline. It was a world where negotiation was necessary, where American kingdoms had leverage, where the future was uncertain rather than foreordained. And in Tenochtitlan, in a city that still floated on its lake despite everything that had tried to destroy it, Historians recorded all of this in codices made of bark paper and European parchment. They recorded how Tlacaelel, the navigator, had crossed the ocean and opened a door that could not be closed, how his people had suffered and adapted and survived, how they had met the Eastern world not as victims but as participants in their own destiny. The story was not over. It would continue for centuries. There would be more diseases and more wars and more struggles for power. The outcome was not certain. The balance could still tip. The Americans could still be overwhelmed. Or they could continue to adapt and grow stronger. Or something else entirely could happen that no one in 1460 or 1500 or 1550 could have predicted. But the story was different. The path had diverged. And that divergence, born from one man's refusal to believe that the ocean was the edge of the world, had changed everything. Chapter 5. The World That Never Was. The 17th century dawned on a world that had reorganized itself around a new reality. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer a barrier, but a highway. Ships crossed it regularly in both directions. Spanish and Portuguese vessels sailed west, carrying European goods and returning with cacao and silver and dyes. Mexica and Inca ships sailed east, carrying gold and textiles and returning with iron and books and horses. The trade was not equal, the terms not always fair, but it existed. And existence, in this context, meant survival. In 1623, a Mexica delegation attended a diplomatic conference in Seville. They came dressed in a hybrid style that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Cotton cloaks dyed in traditional patterns but cut in European fashion. Featherwork incorporated into hats that mimicked Spanish designs. Obsidian jewelry set in silver. They spoke Spanish fluently, though they insisted on using Nahuatl for official documents, which were then translated. They negotiated treaties regarding Caribbean trade routes and territorial boundaries and the treatment of merchants in foreign ports. They were received as ambassadors from a sovereign power, not as curiosities or savages. The European courts still looked down on them, of course, still considered themselves superior, still spoke of eventual conversion and civilization and the burden of bringing true faith to heathens. But they could not simply ignore or conquer the American kingdoms. Not when those kingdoms had armies with steel weapons and cavalry. Not when they controlled resources Europe wanted and could cut off trade if offended. Not when decades of attempted military expeditions had proven costly and inconclusive. So they negotiated instead. And in negotiation, the Americans held cards that should not have existed in any logical version of history. They held immunity to European diseases, built slowly and painfully over generations of managed contact. They held knowledge of European languages and customs and military tactics. They held alliances among themselves, forged through shared experience of the European threat. The Mexica and the Inca, who had never met before contact, now exchanged embassies and coordinated their responses to European demands. In 1657, the first American students enrolled at the University of Salamanca in Spain. They were sons of Mexican nobles, sent to study European science and philosophy and law. They learned Latin and Greek. They read Aristotle and Aquinas. They studied astronomy and found, to their quiet satisfaction, that the Mexica calendar was in some ways more accurate than the Julian calendar Europe still used. They debated theology with Jesuit scholars and defended their own cosmology with the kind of intellectual sophistication that made it harder to dismiss them as primitives. When they returned home, they brought not just European knowledge, but also a broader perspective. They had seen that Europe was not monolithic, that the Spanish and Portuguese and French and English competed and fought among themselves, that European Christianity was fracturing into Catholic and Protestant factions that hated each other as much as they hated any external enemy. This division could be exploited. Alliances could be made with one European power against another. The game of international politics was complex, but the Americans were learning to play it. The 18th century brought new challenges and new adaptations. The Industrial Revolution began in England, and its effects rippled outward. European manufacturing became more efficient. European weapons more deadly. European ships faster and more numerous. The technological gap, which had been narrowing, threatened to widen again. But the Americans adapted here too. Mexican merchants purchased European machines and brought them home to study. Smiths learned new techniques of mass production. Engineers examined steam engines and water wheels and began to replicate them, crudely at first, but with improving competence. By 1780, Tenochtitlan had its first mechanized textile factory, powered by water from the lake and producing cloth at scales that would have been impossible a generation earlier. The population had recovered as well. The terrible die-off of the 16th century had bottomed out around 1550 at perhaps half the pre-contact level. But then, slowly, it began to rise again. Immunity to European diseases was now widespread. New crops from Europe, particularly wheat and rice, supplemented traditional maize and beans. Agricultural productivity increased. By 1750, the Valley of Mexico supported as many people as it had in 1450, and the population was still growing. Politically, the Americas had not unified into a single power. That would have been impossible across such distances and such diverse cultures. But networks of alliance and trade connected them in ways that mattered. The Mexica and the Inca maintained diplomatic relations. The Maya cities, which had survived their own challenges, participated in the broader American response to European pressure. Even the peoples of North America, who had been contacted later and less directly, received warnings and trade goods and knowledge that helped them prepare for the European settlers who would eventually arrive on their shores. By 1800, 340 years after Tlacaelel's first voyage, the world had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Europe was still more industrialized, still more militarily powerful in conventional terms, still convinced of its own cultural superiority. But the Americas were not colonies. They were independent kingdoms and empires that traded with Europe but were not controlled by it. They had their own diplomatic relations with China and Japan and the Ottoman Empire. They were players in a global game rather than pawns to be moved by others. The slave trade that had devastated Africa in our timeline existed here too, but in modified form. The Americans, having no tradition of plantation slavery and having maintained direct contact with West Africa, generally refused to participate. This did not stop the trade entirely. European demand was too strong for that, but it reduced the scale and added moral pressure that might not otherwise have existed. American diplomats in European courts spoke against slavery, and while they were often ignored, they could not be silenced the way colonized peoples could. In 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, ambassadors from Tenochtitlan and Cusco attended the ceremony. They wore their finest regalia. They brought gifts of gold and cacao and textiles. They were seated in positions of honor, not as subjects but as representatives of foreign powers whose friendship France desired. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, treated them with respect. He understood that the world was larger than Europe. That power came in many forms. That alliances mattered. The ceremony was recorded by artists and writers, and in those records, preserved in archives in Paris and Madrid and Tenochtitlan and Cusco, you can see the evidence of a world that diverged. A world where the peoples of the Americas met Europe not as victims of conquest but as participants in a shared, if unequal, history. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, not in the world you know, but in the world that might have been. The world that began when Tlacaelel the navigator refused to accept that the ocean was the edge of everything. You wake up in Mexico City. But it is not called Mexico City. It is called Tenochtitlan, as it has been for 6 centuries. The name never changed because the city never fell. It was never razed by conquistadors, never rebuilt on the ruins of something destroyed. It evolved. It adapted. It grew. The lake is still there. Not as large as it was in 1460. Centuries of development have claimed some of the water, but the central districts still sit on islands, connected by causeways and bridges. The Chinampas are tourist attractions now, floating gardens maintained as historical sites. But some still function, growing vegetables and flowers using techniques that have been refined over centuries. The old and the new exist side by side. Glass and steel skyscrapers rise near stone pyramids that were never demolished because there was no one to demolish them. The language you hear on the streets is not Spanish. Or rather, not only Spanish. Nahuatl is spoken widely, an official language of government and education. It evolved like Latin did, spawning related languages across the region. There are words borrowed from Spanish and English and a dozen other tongues, but the grammar and structure are fundamentally Nahuatl. Children learn it in schools alongside Spanish and English. Street signs are written in all 3 languages. The linguistic landscape is complex in a way that reflects centuries of contact and exchange rather than conquest and replacement. You walk to a market. The foods are familiar but different. Corn and beans and squash, the three sisters that have fed this land since time immemorial. But also wheat and rice and tomatoes and potatoes, all of which exist in this timeline, but with different patterns of spread and adoption. Cacao is everywhere, not as a luxury but as a staple. The drink that so impressed Europeans 5 centuries ago is now consumed globally. There are cacao shops like there are coffee shops in our world. Different preparations, different traditions, but all tracing back to the Mexica who first cultivated it and then shared it with the world. The government building you pass is imposing, a blend of architectural styles. The stepped pyramid form is still visible in the structure, but rendered in modern materials. Concrete and glass and steel. The flag that flies above it shows symbols you recognize from ancient codices. The eagle and the cactus. But surrounding them are other symbols. Representations of the sun and stars. Glyphs that mean something in Nahuatl and have been incorporated into the national identity. This is not a perfect world. There is poverty here, inequality, political corruption, all the problems that afflict human societies, regardless of their history. The Europeans may not have conquered, but they still influenced. Capitalism spread. Industrialization happened, if differently. Wars were fought. Power was contested. The Americas did not become utopias just because they avoided colonization. But the texture of the problems is different. The wounds are different. There is no legacy of total cultural destruction because the destruction was partial. There is no loss of language because the languages adapted rather than disappeared. There is no identity crisis born from being told for centuries that your ancestors were savages and your culture was worthless. The Mexica know who they are. They always did. They never forgot. You board a train. The metro system in Tenochtitlan is extensive, built in the 1970s, using technology that was shared globally in this timeline, as in ours. The stations are decorated with murals showing history, but the history is different. You see Tlacaelel and his ships. You see the meeting with Don Fernando. You see the Great Plague and the recovery. You see centuries of trade and diplomacy and occasional war and eventual equality. It is not propaganda exactly. There are dark moments depicted, suffering and death and mistakes, but it is a continuous history, a story that begins in the deep past and continues without the catastrophic break of conquest. The train takes you to the university, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Tenochtitlan, one of the oldest universities in the Americas in this timeline, founded in 1598 as a deliberate response to European institutions. The students here study everything their counterparts study in our world: physics and medicine and literature and engineering. But they also study the calendar, astronomy as it was practiced before contact and how it evolved after, the engineering of chinampas and modern sustainable agriculture. The codices are not locked away in European museums. They are here. Studied, read, understood. In the library, you find history books. They tell the story differently than you know it. In this timeline, the age of exploration is called the age of contact. It is framed not as European discovery but as mutual recognition. Two hemispheres that had developed separately, coming into contact and having to learn to coexist. The Europeans still get credit for their navigational advances and their ships and their role in creating a global trading network. But the Americans get credit too. For surviving, for adapting, for forcing a negotiation rather than accepting subjugation. You pick up a book about the 20th century. It tells of the world wars, which happened in this timeline too because the fundamental drivers of European conflict were not changed by events in the Americas. But the wars played out differently in some ways. American kingdoms were neutral in the First War, trading with both sides. In the Second War, they allied with the United States and Britain against the Axis powers. Mexican troops fought in Europe. Inca ships transported supplies across the Pacific. The alliance was born not from colonial obligation but from shared interest in defeating fascism. The Cold War was different too. The communist movements that swept through our Latin America found different ground here. Some American kingdoms experimented with socialist policies. Others remained capitalist. But none were simply proxies in a conflict between superpowers. They had their own interests. their own histories, their own reasons for the choices they made. And now, in 2025, the Americas are diverse. Some kingdoms have modernized rapidly. Tenochtitlan is a major global city. Cusco is a center of Andean culture and commerce. Others have developed more slowly, preserving traditional ways while selectively adopting new technologies. The relationship with Europe and Asia and Africa is complex. There is trade and tourism and cultural exchange. There are tensions and competitions and occasional conflicts. But there is also respect, recognition, the kind of interaction that happens between different civilizations rather than between conquerors and conquered. You wonder what else is different. In politics, in technology, in culture. You wonder if the internet exists in this timeline and how it might have developed differently. You wonder about music and art and literature, about what stories are told and who gets to tell them. You wonder about 1,000 details, both large and small. But the fundamental difference is this. The peoples who lived in the Americas in 1460 still exist in recognizable form in 2025. Their languages live. Their cultures live. Their sense of themselves as continuous with their ancestors' lives. They were changed by contact with Europe. Yes, profoundly changed. But they were not erased. They were not replaced. They adapted and survived, and in surviving, they shaped the world as much as the world shaped them. This is the world that never was. The world that might have been if one man had sailed east instead of waiting for others to sail west. If diseases had come gradually instead of all at once. If the ocean had connected rather than separated. If history had turned on different choices made at different moments by different people. It is not a better world necessarily, just a different one. One where the shape of continents and the flow of currents and the decisions of human beings combined in a pattern that led somewhere else. Somewhere we will never see. Somewhere that exists only in imagination and in the space between what happened and what might have happened if the dice had fallen differently. In the end, history is a river. It flows in one direction, shaped by the landscape it moves through, by the rain that feeds it, by the stones that divert it. We live downstream from billions of choices made by billions of people across thousands of years. We cannot see all the tributaries that join to create the current we swim in. We only know that we are here, now, carried by forces we did not choose and cannot fully understand. But sometimes it helps to imagine, to ask what if, to stand on the bank and wonder what would have happened if the river had turned left instead of right at some crucial bend centuries ago. Not because we can change the past. We cannot. But because imagination reveals something about the present, about how contingent everything is, about how many other worlds were possible, about how the one we inhabit is not inevitable but the result of specific circumstances that could have been different. Tlacaelel the navigator was a real person. The Mexica Empire was real. Tenochtitlan on its lake was real. The Chinampas and the calendar and the astronomical knowledge, all real. The Europeans, with their ships and their iron and their diseases, real. The contact that destroyed 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas, terribly real. What we have explored tonight is the question of timing, of sequence, of what might have happened if contact had come differently. If the Americans had reached Europe first, if they had had decades to prepare instead of being overwhelmed in a single generation, if the diseases had spread slowly enough for immunity to develop, if the technological exchange had been more balanced, if the power dynamic had allowed for negotiation instead of only conquest, would it have changed everything? Perhaps not. The fundamental advantages that Europe possessed, the animals and crops and germs and geography that Jared Diamond wrote about, those would still have existed. The balance of power would still have favored the old world. The Americans would still have suffered terribly from diseases. They would still have been at a technological disadvantage in many areas. But margins matter. Timing matters. Preparation matters. The difference between 90% mortality and 50% mortality is the difference between the destruction of a civilization and its survival. The difference between being conquered and being coerced is the difference between losing your language and keeping it, between forgetting who you were and remembering. In our timeline, the great civilizations of the Americas were destroyed so completely that their descendants spent centuries trying to reconstruct what was lost. The languages, the histories, the knowledge, the sense of continuity with the past, all of it shattered by conquest and disease and deliberate erasure. What survived did so in fragments, in stories passed down, in DNA, in the shape of ruins rising from jungles that reclaimed them. It did not have to be that way. It happened that way because of specific circumstances. Because Columbus sailed in 1492 instead of 1450. Because the diseases came all at once instead of gradually. Because the Europeans had horses and steel and guns and the will to use them. Because 1,000 factors aligned in a particular pattern that led to a particular outcome. But other patterns were possible. Other outcomes imaginable. The world we have explored tonight is one of them. A world where the ocean was crossed from the other direction first. Where contact was managed instead of explosive. Where the Americans had time to adapt. Where history flowed differently because the initial conditions were different. Is it realistic? Perhaps not. The challenges of pre-Columbian Americans developing ocean-going vessels are immense. The likelihood of them making contact with Europe before Europe made contact with them is very small. The scenario we have explored required many fortunate circumstances to align, but it was not impossible, just improbable. And sometimes, imagination requires us to follow the improbable to see what it reveals. What it reveals, I think, is that the conquest was not inevitable, that the outcome was not predetermined by some law of history or progress or racial superiority, that human choices mattered, that if circumstances had been different, if timing had been different, if chance had fallen differently, the peoples of the Americas might have survived as continuous civilizations rather than being shattered and reformed into something new. It reveals that the world we live in is one possibility among many, that the borders and languages and power structures we take for granted are the products of contingency, not necessity. That imagination can show us paths not taken, and in doing so, help us understand the path we are on. So as you drift towards sleep, as the images and ideas from this journey settle into your mind, I invite you to hold this thought. History could have been different. The world could have been different. The peoples who lived here before European contact were not destined to be destroyed. They were destroyed by specific causes that, under different circumstances, might not have occurred or might have occurred differently. And in remembering that, perhaps we can better understand our own moment, our own choices, the ways in which the future is not predetermined but open, shaped by what we do and what we choose and how we respond to the circumstances we find ourselves in. The ocean that Tlacaelel crossed in our story exists. You can sail it today. The currents and winds he followed are real. The peoples he represented were real. The cities they built were real. What was imagined tonight was not their existence but their survival, their adaptation, their continuation. And maybe that is enough. To remember that they existed, to honor what they achieved, to recognize that their destruction was not inevitable, to imagine a world where they endured. Thank you for taking this journey with me. If you found it meaningful, if it sparked your imagination or made you think differently about history, I hope you will subscribe to join future explorations. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Tell me what resonated, what troubled you, what other paths through history you might want to explore. And now, let the images fade. Let the sounds quiet. Let your mind settle like silt in still water. Somewhere across an ocean, the sun is rising. Ships are sailing. People are waking to their own stories and their own worlds. And you, here, now, can rest knowing that you have traveled farther than miles can measure. You have visited the world that never was. Sleep well. Dream of other worlds. And remember that the one we live in is stranger and more fragile and more full of possibility than we often imagine. Good night.